It's Friday, so it's the day we have with us Jason Rheins. Jason is a senior research fellow at Montessorium, and every Friday he helps us navigate some philosophical topics that are complex or difficult or interesting or all together. So today we're going to discuss anarchism. So quite often, whenever I'm in an objectivist conference, there are always in the audience some young people from the libertarian movement, some young people who have just discovered the ideas of liberty, and they can't really, or sometimes they're more committed than anarcho-capitalists, but they always have the same question. What's the big deal? What is our difference? Isn't the fact that we disagree on whether it's going to be some state or no state, isn't this something which is not very important? And of course, there's a lot of literature in objectivism about why it is important. Now, this is a topic that has been dealt with many times, but today we're going to focus on one particular angle. We try to find the best arguments that anarchists have against what they would call minarchists. The term, I don't like it, but you get what it means. People who are in favor of a small state, we would call it a state that only supports individual rights. So we're going to find these good arguments and we're going to see what would be our reply to them. So we're trying to steelman the anarcho-capitalist argument. So the number one complaint that anarchists have is that...
Let me just jump in and just say, so this is Nikos's choice of topic. I want to say at the outset, I have never really spent much time studying anarchism. I know just a little bit, mostly by secondhand account. And so I'm going to just, I don't know if these are the best arguments for anarchism, but Nikos knows a lot more about this than I do. So let's just take it for granted for our purposes that these are relatively, he was trying to find strong arguments. These are the best ones he came up with today. And I mean, I can tell you what I think, but I approach this as somebody who's not given this much.
This is an important clarification because the same applies to me. So here we are thinking out loud. So again, this is not objectivist rebuttal of these arguments. This is me and Jason thinking out loud about these points. So here's the first argument they always bring up. They say, look, you people, when you want to attack anarchism, you bring up the example of Somalia, that Somalia is an example of anarchism. And as a situation where there is no central state and there are fighting gangs and fighting tribes. And they say this is a very, very cheap shot because we are thinking of a different kind of anarchism. We're different of a kind of anarchism where it is peaceful, where the corporation, so to speak, who have as their duty and as their job to secure order, actually do their job. So they say by bringing up Somalia, it's as if someone saying, look, having a state is what Nazi Germany or what Soviet Union looks like, therefore checkmate small state people. So, and this argument has also an expansion which says that, could you people name me one time in history where your small or minimal or minarchist or individual rights respecting state has existed? Therefore, if your thing has never existed, why do you tell us that our thing could never exist and it could be Somalia? So do you have any take on that, Jason?
Yeah, sure. So my first take is that this is, I think, more of a counter argument against a criticism of anarchism than an argument perhaps proper, but it's really the best system. It's more along the lines of, you bring up the following examples, those are not us. A kind of no true Scotsman type of argument. Now, the first thing to observe here is that this is not unique to anarchism. A lot of political philosophies use this and even moral philosophies use this very same tactic. So it's easy enough to kind of say, well, I've read Plato's Republic. I think Plato is a totalitarian, and here's why. And then someone says, yeah, but the way he writes it, no force is going to be necessary. Everybody's in the city is kind of committed to the rule of these philosopher kings. There's no objections. And similarly, you could say, sure, I mean, like it's not fair to bring up Stalinism as a rebuke of communism because, the way Marx and Engels pictured it, it would work in this other way. And so the first thing I think we have to figure is that there are two sort of aspects of a kind of political philosophy here that are distinct. One is a kind of view is a series of arguments and claims about human nature, about ethics, about how the state ought to function, and those arguments succeed or fail. Then there's secondly, what is a theory formulated in the terms you formulated in? What does that end up looking like in practice? Now, it may be that some theories, just given A, human nature, and B, the way they are formulated, cannot actually be put into practice in the way that their advocates believe or hope they will be. So it may be that, like, just because of how humans work, just because of how the world works, you will never get a peaceful you will never get a non-coercive communist state. It can't work. It will, or it is too open to the following things. So I take it that if anarchists say something like, what we picture is this non-violent thing, then the answer is, well, that's great, but that's what you picture. Do you have any reason for believing that having that won't descend? Let's assume, even if it's not really true, let's assume that you could get to that state. What keeps it that way? What prevents it from devolving back into gang or tribal warfare or civil war, right? So we have this peaceful thing where different people, there's no central power or state, nobody has a monopoly on force, of retaliatory force. Okay, no one has a monopoly on retaliatory force. That presumably means that I can perhaps initiate force without the risk of a state or a massive police force taking me down. And maybe many people wouldn't do that. Many people are prudent enough, but not everybody. So why don't I do that? And if I do that, and there's no state, or there isn't allowed to be a state, what recourse does someone else have other than arming up his gang and fighting back in their way and getting me before I get them? So that's just to say that I think if you take the theory, one way to do this, I'm not sure if this always works, but one way to do this is imagine you have the ideal situation that their theory envisions. Again, I think that's giving them more than they deserve, but just imagine it and then ask, how would you keep it? What would prevent that from being maintained? Why wouldn't it just collapse into this thing we fear? Similarly, you have a bunch of philosopher kings, and their successors are just not these incredibly wise, incredibly benevolent rulers who know the good and rule, selflessly, etc. What if they're, in fact, Plato even imagines this situation. Yeah, it would degenerate really fast and it would be horrible. I mean, look, even if they are as benevolent as you think, them being able to tell you how to live is pretty awful anyhow. And so lastly, the claim of, well, hey, you don't have instances of your political system. Well, look, maybe we do, maybe we don't. I think there's variation in the more and the less. And so you can say there are situations where you have less of the kind of government we find obtrusive, but enough of the kind of government we consider necessary and good. And when you have something that approaches enough of the good kinds of government functions and few enough of the bad malfunctions, what you find is really good. And that's enough. And then you can say, and as you have less of this or more of that, it gets worse. As you have more of this and less of that, it gets better. That doesn't mean that there's no amount of the good functions. It means that there's a certain amount of absolutely of the good functions and a certain minimum of, or an elimination of the malfunctions.
Right. And I will give this point to the anarchists as opposed to the communists. So at least they can describe how what you said, this utopia would look like, whereas with the communists is not the case. Okay, second point.
Can they really, though? I mean, do they really?
Well, they would say...
I think they probably can. There's some amount of it, just because, what a world would look like, at least a kind of scientifically or industrially advanced world would look like without property rights, or without private property, I should say, is pretty hard to kind of picture. I mean, well, you do have kind of statist examples, but what it would be, how this peaceful arrangement would work, how private security firms would operate peacefully. They say it. I don't know that they can really picture it. Anyway.
So let's go then to the second point, which is related to this. Why would you trust the police to find who robbed your house or who stole your car, which usually they don't, no one cares anyway from the police? Why would you trust them more than Apple? So the anarchists would say, the problem with you, Jason, is you lack imagination. Would you imagine how more effective law and order would be if those in charge were Amazon, Apple, or Google, like a Google police or something like that? So in the same way you subscribe to Amazon Prime and you get an excellent service, you'd subscribe to Amazon Police. You'd press a panic button and a drone would be by your house in 5 seconds. Or if someone hit you, you'd have cameras on your glasses, and then they would find him within 5 minutes or things like that. So what would be your reply to that? That law and order would be way, 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 way more efficient.
So, okay, I think there are a couple arguments here. The first argument is that people have individual rights, whether or not they hold a subscription. So people sometimes talk about, if you have a private firefighting company, would they have to come to your house or something like that? And it might be that, you have just a kind of agreement with anybody living in a certain area with the local, with government and so on, that, the firefighters can't turn down a kind of call for help, but if they come, they can charge you a certain rate. It would have to be worked out. But in the case of police, a police person seeing you getting mugged doesn't get to first check whether you've made a donation to the benevolent brotherhood of policemen and then decide whether to protect you. You have certain rights. The government has to protect them. And without those, I think the situation would be dire and quite terrible. And Apple doesn't have that responsibility. Another way to put it is, a government has a certain moral responsibility to defend individual rights. And there may be certain things that the government can demand a certain kind of charge for, something like that, to raise basic revenue for its operation. But there are other things that it can't sort of hold that over you. So that's the first thing about just why I don't think it's the right kind of entity. The second thing is, you could ask yourself, how well do companies, police themselves in a variety of ways where they have a legal responsibility already, not just criminally, but also in terms of civil responsibilities. Now, again, this is against the background of a government that ought to be doing some of the policing here, but there are various places where companies are sort of free to self-police, and they're clearly prudential and decent things they ought to do. Maybe they don't have to do, but it would be in their long-term interest, and it would also be decent. And many of them don't do it. Companies are not omniscient. They don't always know what's in their interest. They don't always know what would be the best thing for their for retaining or building kind of customers, let alone taking care of them. And the last thing I would say is, maybe you shouldn't trust the police where you are. Maybe you should, maybe you shouldn't. It's not a guarantee. There's no reason that a government can't be corrupt. The problem is, ideally, it's possible for a police system that has public accountability, that is protecting the right kinds of law, or enforcing the right kinds of laws, it has right kinds of selection, actively I think, decent, in theory, decent and non-prejudicial arbiters of justice, or at least of kind of protection security. What's not possible, in principle, is for your private company that you hire to establish justice. So the problem is not, so the issue is not, oh, can you really trust police? The issue is rather, why would anyone trust the company you're paying to investigate me, trust them to be fair to me rather than to you who is paying them? In other words, this is just a kind of extension of an argument that Locke gives in the second treatise that one reason we turn to government rather than the state of nature. Locke thinks the rights and the principles involved are there in a state of nature, but the problem is that we, on our own, kind of given to partial justice, are not the best arbiters of justice and retaliation. You murder my mom. Maybe I have a moral right to stop you from hurting other people in my family. But am I really the person who should make the decision about how much punishment that is and how to best achieve it? And, no, some neutral third party should be that. Now, if the chief of police happens to be your brother-in-law, we might have a problem, but then we have various laws and mechanisms for conflict of interest for the government. And I think those would have to come into effect. Again, it's not that the police can't be corrupt. It's that they can be non-corrupt. They can be a neutral third party or mediator who has to follow certain rules. Whereas if I hire you to do a job, ideally you're going to do the best job. And it might be that there's profit in Apple behaving like a police in a regular country, but it might be that there's more profit for them in being mercenaries. And here's the other thing that this example or argument typically forgets. We have to imagine that Apple is not Apple, which is a corporation that is based in the United States, which mostly for a little while yet at least has the rule of law. This would be some kind of organization in a country without laws and without government. And why should we expect that security company would behave in the kind of sane, long-term thinking way that Apple does under a government? In other words, Apple, as a private security firm in no man's land, in anarchy, has to operate the way a consortium of force, Apple Force, the way a consortium force would in anarchy, which is to say they would gang up, they would build fortresses, they would, they would not, try to make, have customer signed agreements and EULAs and all that, because there's no government agencies to fall back on. So I think that's the most important thing. Private companies in anarchy would probably look very, very different, and they would not be as reasonable and law abiding or order oriented as companies that exist in a system of government.
And also something to follow up on that is that, and again, this is me, this is not the objectivist line, this is Nikos saying out loud. Nothing would prevent you, even when having a government, to have private security. So, for example, bodyguards, investigators, but they would not be able to breach someone else's rights. So, for example, someone stole your car, the investigator would find that person, or your bodyguard will have the right to defend you even with force if the police is not anywhere in sight. So nothing would stop you to do that. What they would stop you to do is take the law, quote, in your own hands in terms of, as you said, oh, you harm me, now I'm going to gouge out both your eyes, for example, because now you have no right, which is a bit in not miles away from what happens in Sharia law, for example, where if you are harmed, you have the right to say, okay, that person dies or that person does not die. So let me then bring to another argument, which is the anarchists will say all the things that you accuse us of, which is, let's say, gangs taking over, has also happened with the state. So, for example, and I'm not taking extremes like Nazism. So when the radical left was in power in Greece, there was a moment in time where my father was paying something equivalent to 70% of his income in taxes, 70. So you had this type of situation. So again, they would say, look, at the end of the day, if you have reasonable people, anarchism will work. If you have reasonable people, you will have an objectivist, you will have a society where the state only protects individual rights, as you objectivists believe. So at the end of the day, isn't it basically the same question? How can we get to a place where we have a critical mass of people who want a peaceful society where we respect each other's rights? And therefore, whether then we're going to have a state or whether we're going to have two perfectly reasonable security companies. One is going to be the Jason and the other is going to be, I don't know, the Yaron company. So reasonable people, right-respecting people. So at the end of the day, it all comes down to having, changing the culture so that the critical mass eschews these ideas. So what's your take in that?
So I'm not sure I completely understand the argument. Once again, I kind of think it's a bit of a counter argument or kind of anarchism on the defensive. In other words, I imagine an argument for anarchism to be something along the lines of all governments are wrong. Here are the reasons why we should have anarchism. Or something along the lines of all governments are liabilities in the following way. Anarchism would work best. I think it's a little bit more like this would work best. But again, what I heard and the last thing you sort of said was something along the lines of it would work if people were rational. You might think just about anything would be better the more people were rational, because rational people are better and they do less bad and more good. But you might also say that rational people wouldn't do certain things and would do others, or are less likely to do certain things and are more likely to do others. The real question comes down to which is a more rational system, because if we assume people are rational enough, we can assume that they'll be rational enough to have a reasonable system. And so the question is no government a reasonable system or reasonable absence of system, or is that unreasonable for human beings to try to exist without law and without a state? And so I think that just kind of kicks the question back another step. I do think that, you used to see, some anarcho-capitalists make sort of economic argument. And by the way, I think that's a contradiction in terms. I think capitalism is a system of individual rights, including property rights. I don't think anarchism is a system of rights. Some people get to anarchism by kind of reifying and taking all the context away out of property rights and just kind of make it this absolute. But in any case, I don't actually think anarcho-capitalism is a thing, makes sense as a term. But in any case, some anarcho-capitalists would make the argument that the market forces in an anarchist situation would mitigate against, indeed, would strongly discourage initiation, of course. You would have private security companies. Private security companies would be looking at their bottom line. That what they know is that armed conflicts are very, very expensive in terms of labor and training and so on. And so they just wouldn't do it. And two things. One, how do you know? How do you know that there wouldn't be some, private security innovator who says, actually, if we just cut our costs enough, it makes a lot of sense for us to kill the other guys. Like we just have to be get better at getting child soldiers because they're really cheap and will do what they say, guns that are easy to shoot for them to use, and like strategic information about where to ambush our enemies. And if we do that, like the cost of losses isn't that big. There are more kids all the time. The guns are, there's 300 million guns left from when America used to have a government. And, it's easy, right? Why wouldn't they do that? Especially because like, once we're the only game in town, like we get everything, is how they might reason. And like everything is the whole pie. So that's much better. Similarly, just look at what's come about in behavioral economics. Yes, this idealized rational market agent would behave in certain ways with perfect availability of information, perfectly self-transparent preferences which form well-ordered sets, and so on. And they would do these things. And then, economists bothered to actually look at people after decades and centuries even, and realized, oh wait, people don't do that. Or a lot of people don't do that. So I think it's fair to say that any system has to plan for the eventuality that many people, hopefully not a majority, but many people will behave irrationally in various ways, and prepare to protect and insulate those who are rational from those who are not, or at least from those who are violently irrational, if not.
Let me ask a question on this. So in a current system, though, what would stop these many rational people of voting in a communist government or a leftist government or whatever, a statist government, and then suddenly you lose everything?
Well, so first off, there are levels of implementation. And this is a combination of mores or customs on the one hand and constitutional law. So first of all, depending on the Constitution, it's easier or harder to change certain laws. There are laws of laws and laws governing the change of laws. And so in some cases, like even if you voted in a communist, they couldn't change everything overnight, or they couldn't get away with changing everything overnight because you have sufficiently strong customs or mores that prevent them from just breaking all the rules. I mean, leges sine moribus vanas, right? So like laws without morals are empty. And so, like we have a bunch of election laws, but if like everyone in the Republican Party decides, who gives a fuck? We'll just lie and say it was stolen, and then make phony electors, and then remember that the 5 ultra-conservative justices at the Supreme Court will approve this anyway because they're in our gang. I mean, at a certain point, if there aren't enough people along the way, people of conscience, including, like say some Republicans in Georgia who stop Trump stealing efforts, you don't have that, then they'll take over, right? Like these are human institutions. Nothing makes them invulnerable. Certainly nothing makes an institution invulnerable against human irrationality and evil. But that very fact undercuts or undermines it. But just because institutions are corruptible doesn't mean that they're not necessary. It may be that certain institutions are necessary for human flourishing, and they can be just as we need them as against not having them at all, so we need them in a certain way and not in other ways. It may be that it may even be that the worst kinds of misgovernance are worse than the worst kinds of anarchy. Arguably,
the Holocaust is an obvious example.
Right. Or being in North Korea today. Arguably, being in Somalia is better than being in North Korea. I don't know. They might be equally horrible. I don't know. I'd leave it open to debate. The point is, that doesn't change the fact that you might need some government and not others. You started off by pointing out that some of these young students who come in and they're interested in theories of liberty, some come by way of libertarianism or economic approaches to capitalism, and they're interested in objectivism. And they say something like, there's so little state that, you sort of believe in. Why do you still have any of it left? Or what's the difference? And, that's sort of like an atheist living in a polytheistic culture, like in India or ancient Greece, an atheist looking at some early monotheist, some Christian or Jew, and going, you get rid of so many gods. You get rid of Zeus, you get rid of Athena, you get rid of Apollo. I mean, aren't you basically just an atheist like me? What do you need this one last God for? And to the monotheist, it's like, what are you talking about? That's the most important thing of all, right?
That's a good example.
In other words, I'm not a monotheist or even a henotheist. You believe in one God, not necessarily the only one, because I don't believe in gods or don't believe that gods are important. I just don't believe in this plethora of gods. And I think that's all messed up and that's idolatry, but there's one true God. Again, I'm an atheist. I'm with the atheist here. But what I'm not with is the atheist thinking that there isn't a principal difference between the monotheist and himself relative to the polytheist. It's just the opposite. In most respects, monotheism is different from polytheism in more than just numerical terms. It's not just like monotheism is polytheism with every god but one removed. It is its own creature, but nevertheless, it is not just a stone's throw away from atheism. It's not at all. And similarly, I don't think, say, the objectivist view is just a stone's throw away from anarchism. I've even heard some objectivists say, and I think this is well put, that, when people argue, like, we don't want, we want to reduce the size of government, and you might say, or the strength of government, and you might say, no, we want a strong government. We want a government, you might even say, as big as necessary. We just want to reduce its scope, right? So we should have as big a military as we need to defend ourselves from our actual enemies. We should have as many, judges as are necessary to hear trials, right? Hopefully that won't be too many, but it may have to be a significant number. What we don't want is that army to defending a country not worth saving, and those judges ruling on laws that never should have been passed, and those cops enforcing laws that basically punish their citizens and turn the cops into, a military occupation on their own home soil. So that's,
I'm impressed, Jason, because you said I'm not an expert, but you gave examples that I've been thinking this issue since I found out about libertarians around 2013, 14, actually before I found out about objectives, particularly the one about monotheism and theism. That was an excellent example. That landed the argument for me. So thank you for that. Okay, let's go to Super Chat, because as we said, today is going to be a relatively short episode. So thank you very much, Marilyn. I appreciate so much every time how much you support us. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jonathan. Same applies to you. Thank you for your constant support. So Philosophical Zombie Hunter asks, actually points out, Adam Mossoff pointed out that anarchists do not want IP rights. By the way, that's correct. They don't want. That would hurt innovation and wealth and make anarchist societies poor and primitive. So do you want to give a 20-second version about IP rights and what's our main difference with that? And I'll come back with a book recommendation, which is the moment out of my reach. So I'll be back in 10 seconds, but I can hear you.
So some anarchists kind of get into what they're defending through a libertarian conception, or perhaps even misconception, of property rights or rights of liberty, and then kind of work their way backwards of, if it's my property, why shouldn't I be allowed to do this? And if I have property rights, why shouldn't I be allowed to own a tank or an aircraft carrier or whatever? But then it's typical, but I think with most anarchists, that once you get to sort of like intellectual property, why can't I just take this music and so on? Or suddenly, where did the property rights go? Because intellectual property rights are perhaps more abstract, or perhaps because this is a place where most reasonably intellectual and not too antisocial kind of people they say, oh, I'm not looking to murder someone for their wallet, right? Like, and so I don't think that my no government state would have that. But yeah, I want to download that movie, like, of course. And what's the harm, right? Or something like that. And I just think it's an example, either perhaps inconsistency or just, yeah, there's your true colors. I mean, it's like, turns out with most, people don't want to be pirates, thieves, and murderers. But most people don't mind being IP pirates. And so, that's just not something they're building into their picture of do whatever you want.
Right. Makes sense.
Or
So,
whatever you can get away with.
and you mentioned that we are not experts. So I would recommend, if people are particularly interested on this topic, there's a collection of essays on the differences between objectivism and libertarianism, including and anarchism, including discussions with some actual libertarians and anarchists. So check out the book Foundations of a Free Society, the reflections on Ayn Rand's political philosophy. It's edited by Greg Salmieri and Robert Mayhew, and it dives deep in all these issues that we have covered. So
it's really excellent. I especially recommend the kind of 3-part piece from Daryl Wright, which converted an old course he gave me two decades ago. It's really great.
So on these 3 essays by Daryl Wright, when I was writing the Tribalist book and I had to understand a bit more something around free speech, these were my go-to essays. I don't remember exactly how I went there, but they're very, very good. These and Tara's essay, The Free Speech Vernacular. Thank you very much, Shruti, for the 100 Indian rupees. Thank you very much. No idea how much this is worth, but thanks a lot for your contributions. She says, thanks for the interesting conversation. Thank you, Shruti. And thanks again to Marlene. You have our appreciation, and thank you for your constant support. Okay, coming up, 10 p.m. UK time, the TV talk on Station 11 with Mark Pellegrino, Jennifer Buani, and Jacqueline Schumann. So that's all from us. I'm catching a plane to Georgia to get with Yaron and give a all-day conference on on interesting things. So if you're in Georgia or if you're anywhere near, we're going to be in Tbilisi this weekend. Jason, you also need to go back to a conference or something, still fighting the battle of ideas. So thanks, everyone. We're going to be back with Jason next Friday. Have a good weekend.